Welcome to Tanakh Talk. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting to you live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another fine episode of Rabbi Michael Skobac. A rabbi cross-examines the New Testament, coming to you from Rabbi Michael Skobac out of JewsForJudaism.ca. So without further ado, I will introduce you now to our beloved rabbi for the evening. Wow, there we go again. You would think I would have learned my lesson by now.
Oh, wow.
You know, it's a continuous learning curve around here. It really, really is. It's like there's so many buttons, and, you know, I'm pretty good at multitasking for the most part. That depends on what you want to include in the most definition.
I like the way that sounded, actually.
It almost overlaid in the right moment.
Yeah. You could be a sound engineer.
And you're the light engineer. We got that covered for the night. So,
okay, so we're a good team.
We are an excellent team. Rabbi, it's good to see you again. And thank you so much. Man, I tell you what, I'm so grateful. I tell you every week, or I should tell you every week, how grateful I am and how grateful we are to have you available for us to be able to go through this. You know, I had a very interesting conversation with my customer, one of my customers today. I've been every once in a while, I've known him for about 3 to 4 years now, and I've been doing work for them. And he's seen my transfiguration from, okay, that was not intended. That totally was not intended. I promise you. It must have been like it run in the back of my mind. But he's seen me like change from being this messianic person to the non-messianic person to it's really weird. And well, today he asked me while his family was there to tell them a little bit about my broadcast. And one thing I told him, and I wasn't being rude, I was being very respectful. I was explaining to them what the broadcasts were all about, you know, with you and with Rabbi Singer. And one of the ladies, she said, well, we're just going to have to get your website then so that we can actually watch in. I said, no, you probably don't want to do that because I know they're kind of from a Christian background. Now, they themselves are not actively participating per se, but that just the fact that that's there and their family would really, right off the bat, would possibly come across wrong to them. So since I'm going to be knowing them for a long time, I'll slowly kind of weave them into it. But I basically told them, I said, well, what I'm doing here and what Tanakh Talk is all about really does not agree with Christianity at all. In fact, they're completely diametrically opposed. And she just kind of looked at me with this interesting look, almost with openness, like, really? Maybe I would like to hear that. So anyway, strangely enough, Rabbi, it's good to see you.
Yeah, you know, I ran into maybe 3 potential new audience members the other day. I took a pop into one of the Jewish bookstores here in Toronto.
Oh, wow.
Very, very small place, very crowded. And there were 3 young Christian evangelicals that were in the store. It was obvious that they were sort of like kids in a candy shop in a big Jewish bookstore. And I think they wanted to have an experience in the Jewish community. And I happened to just walk in at that time, and we got into a very hour-long discussion.
Wow.
And I forgot how it came up. I just mentioned that I'm, doing this program on the book of Matthew, and they all sort of did a double take.
A rabbi knows the New Testament? What's up with that?
So I gave them the the URL for the website, and I said, yeah, so if they're listening, you 3 guys that I met the other day, hi.
That's awesome.
If you're tuning in. Yeah, that was great.
That is completely awesome. I mean, that's what this whole thing is about, is just making it available to people who have an ear to hear, and man, I'm so thankful. I know everybody else here is too. So, okay, Rabbi, what do you have for us tonight? Matthew, chapter 17. We are episode 20.
That's unbelievable.
20 episodes. That's just crazy. I'm glad.
That's more than a third of a year.
Yeah. Wow. There you go. So we're moving right along.
Yeah, it's quite amazing. Quite amazing. Yes, we got to figure out what we're going to do when we get to the end of Matthew, because I think a lot of at least Mark and Luke are going to be repetitive. So we'll have to figure out how we're going to handle Mark and Luke. Maybe we'll just summarize large parts of it. I think when we get to John, it's going to be a different ball game. But we'll have to do some thinking about how to handle Mark and Luke, because just to go over the same stories again and again is going to be monotonous.
I actually had a thought maybe here's not the place to discuss it, but I'll run it by you real quick. Now the viewing audience can hear, maybe they can offer some feedback too. What if since we're doing the Gospels and they're technically all supposed to be parallels anyway, what if we did Matthew and then we went straight to Acts, and then we did Mark and then we went to Corinthians, then we did Luke, and you know what I'm saying? What about, would that be too confusing if we did that?
That make me dizzy.
Kind of like the way I shoot my videos. My wife said, "Why do you keep moving the camera so much? Sit still."
That's the new style.
So
we'll have a powwow. We'll discuss.
That sounds good. Maybe we'll get some good feedback from the viewers.
Yeah, I'd be interested in hearing what people think.
That'll be good.
Unless people are really, really, sort of itching for, every little last detail of the Gospels. But I don't know. I think that, especially, I'm really having second thoughts about doing Mark and Luke, unless again we could sort of pick on those pieces that are significant where they differ from Matthew. But I think Luke is different than I'm sorry. I think John is different enough that we can go through John and then go into Acts. But we'll discuss it.
That sounds good. Actually, I kind of like the way that you're pushing, because I think because you've done such a thorough job in Matthew so far, that might work pretty well. Is just to kind of summarize, Mark and Luke, pardon me, and just so we can kind of cover some more territory. So
tonight we have a fascinating chapter.
Yes, sir.
Because the book of Matthew now is beginning to sort of turn a corner, and it's sort of moving now towards the climax of soon they'll be heading into Jerusalem for the end of the story. So this chapter 17 in Matthew is really considered by many Christians to be like one of the major events in the life of Jesus. They speak about his virgin birth and his baptism by John, and the transfiguration here, and then there's going to be the crucifixion and the resurrection and the ascension. So these are the sort of the highlights of his life, and this is actually a very interesting piece here, because we're told that Jesus takes James and Peter and John with him, and they go up to a high mountain. The scholars go into great discussions about what high mountain this was. They don't really know. It's not the kind of thing I'm interested in taking up time discussing, but it is interesting where there's all these discussions about where this might have been. And it says in verse 2 that he was transfigured before them. Now, this is a word, I think, really which has its roots in Latin, and it's really very hard for any reader to know exactly what this means. But basically, it seems that what it's describing is that Jesus' form, he was transformed basically into some kind of luminous figure before his disciples. That, he didn't look anymore like a flesh and blood human being. He looked more transcendent, more resplendent, more glorious, more radiant, and less physical, I guess, and more spiritual. And, the question, I guess, that, is interesting to ask is, well, did this really happen? I guess it's a question always worth asking about the gospel stories, meaning, are we reading facts, like a newspaper report that it actually happened, or are we reading, an evangelist's account of, what they would like us to hear? So it's interesting and to ask the question, but to contrast this story, and really all the stories, we'll get to this in great depth when we discuss the resurrection, but it's interesting that the major, I would say, foundational stories here in the New Testament are very different than the foundational stories in the Hebrew scriptures. Here you have basically what is a very private event. You have, Jesus transforming somehow visually in front of 3 of his disciples, and and none of those 4 people are writing about it, by the way. Matthew wasn't one of the people there. So Matthew's just telling this story, and I guess it's not a bad question to ask is, well, did it really happen as reported? And the truth is, we have no way of disproving it, meaning that it's basically take it or leave it. You've got to basically accept Matthew as gospel truth uncritically, or you can question it. And I think the difference is that when you come to, let's say, the foundational event in Jewish history, which is the revelation at Mount Sinai, so there it's interesting that if it didn't happen, if that event never took place, and whoever wrote the scriptures wrote it the way it's written, which is to say that, all 3 million Jews stood at Mount Sinai and they heard the voice of God and they saw the smoking mountain and the thunder and the lightning, etc. If that didn't happen, it would certainly have been questioned later on, because the important way in which the Hebrew scriptures are written is not to say that it was a private revelation that Moses received, meaning that if we're reading a story where it says in the book of Exodus and Deuteronomy, just saying straight out that, God spoke to Moses at Mount Sinai, Moses came down and Moses told us all the things God said to him, again, it's take it or leave it. There's no way of refuting whether that happened or not. But the way the Hebrew scriptures are written is to say that what happened to Moses on Mount Sinai was not a private event, it was a public event. And all 3 million people that were there actually heard God speak to Moses. So that if it didn't happen, and then at some later point someone is writing up the story and saying, your ancestors actually heard God speak to Moses at Mount Sinai, the people would have said, really? If it happened, how come they never told us? Because if people actually had witnessed
a national revelation,
that was not the kind of thing you would just forget about. You would tell your kids who were maybe too young at the time or not born yet, you would tell them about that. Because, think about what people actually spend a lot of time telling their kids. I had this canoe trip and I caught a bass that was 2 feet long. People recount and they revel in the significant events of their life. And, if someone, for example, had, today, had gone up in a spaceship and landed on the moon and with 10 other people saw something, they would talk about it. They would tell other people about it. And, the idea that this event happened at Mount Sinai and people would not tell their children and grandchildren would be absurd. So the difference is that the recounting, the writing up of a public revelation, if it didn't happen, it would have been questioned. People would have said, you're telling me that, a number of years ago, my ancestors stood at Mount Sinai and they all heard Moses get a communication from God. Well, why didn't I hear this from my parents or my grandparents? So the person that would be making up such a story, if it didn't happen, would be very foolish to say that all the people heard. They would have just kept it private and say, yeah, Moses went up and he told everyone that God spoke to him. And then it's take it or leave it. So there is this story here that's quite an amazing story. It's dramatic, and there's no real way of disconfirming it. And that really leaves it open to suspicion, meaning we'll see later on John, the gospel writer John, says that they're writing these stories to convince people to believe in Jesus. So we already see the gospel writers are not objective historians or journalists that are necessarily giving you what happened. They're telling you that we are here, we have an agenda. We're here to convince you to believe in Jesus. And therefore, we wonder if they invent stories or exaggerate stories or embellish stories in order to create a more sellable product. I don't know. It doesn't mean that we have proof here that this didn't happen.
You bring up a very interesting point, though. I can tell you from my own experience, I was part of an evangelical team, a youth ministry team, at one point in time as a Christian before I even left the church and went to Messianic Judaism. But in this point in time, I heard story after story with all of our friends in our circles where we would actually tell stories that were fictional but truthful, meaning they could have happened, but they didn't, just to try to further convince the person we're talking to. And this was a normal thing. And at first I thought I felt guilty the first time I did it, but then I started hearing everybody else was doing it too. And I'm thinking, well, if it's effective, I guess what's the harm in it? And I never once even considered that to be the case here until you just mentioned it. But if that was the case, like now with so many, there's a high probability that at least is plausible in the scenario.
Yeah, I'm raising it as a question. I have no way of proving it didn't happen. Now, what some Christian commentaries claim is that this event makes it clear that, at least to the disciples who witnessed it, that Jesus was divine. That's, part of the implication, meaning it's one question is, did it happen? The second question is, what would it prove? What does it mean?
Right.
And so many Christian commentaries take this story as, again, another piece of evidence proving that Jesus is divine. And it's interesting that some of the Christian commentaries to Matthew connect this story here with Daniel chapter 7, verse 9, which describes the Ancient of Days, which is a description of God, the Almighty Creator, and it describes God as wearing a garment of white as snow. And so here in this story, it speaks about Jesus having dazzling white clothing, and that reminds them, it sort of sounds similar to the way God is described in Daniel chapter 7. And so some Christians say, you see, this again is sort of proof that Jesus is God in the flesh. Jesus is God himself. Obviously in Daniel chapter 7, he didn't actually see God. What he's seeing is a vision, a prophetic vision, in the same way that Ezekiel chapter 1, Yechezkel the prophet also has a prophetic vision, but it's a vision. It's not a seeing, the form of God. God doesn't have form. But what's interesting here to me is that quite a few Christian commentaries link this transfiguration scene where Jesus has these dazzling white clothes to the description of God in Daniel, where he's described as having, white clothing as white as snow. But in that passage in Daniel, it speaks about one like a man, or a son of man, who approaches the Ancient of Days. And Christians insist that's the Messiah, who they say is Jesus. So the reading of Daniel itself becomes difficult when they have to awkwardly say that both of those characters in Daniel chapter 7, in that vision, both the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man who comes and approaches the Ancient of Days, they're both Jesus. So it's sort of, I think, it's awkward to want to have your cake and eat it too. Meaning, if they're insisting that that the being who's the Ancient of Days, the description of God in the dazzling white clothing is Jesus, who's wearing the white garments here. Jesus is the Ancient of Days. It becomes difficult to assert that he's also the Son of Man, the one like a man who approaches the Ancient of Days and is given dominion and glory and power and etc. and all those things. So I think that it's difficult to say, I think, that this kind of experience, even to James and Peter and John, that if they even had that experience, I don't think it really proves that Jesus is God. I mean, my wife tells me that she once went to a Hindu ashram, and there was a Swami Muktananda who was able to give off the same appearance, that his whole body looked like it was glowing and shining.
Wow.
And it's not that unusual, and people can do that. So don't ask me how.
Sure.
But people have experienced that, in very, very divine circumstances. So, just because you have a vision, you see something, I can't tell you how many people that I've met over the last 30 years who've told me that they actually saw Jesus. Jesus appeared to them in their living room. Jesus showed up in their, bedroom, and they saw him, and they saw his white garments. And they're telling you that they had this vision. They saw something, and some of them insist it wasn't a vision. Some of them, they say there was actually a physical presence. So you have to really think about what these claims are about, what they really would prove. Now, what is fascinating to me, I think we discussed this briefly last week, is that many, actually the majority of Christian commentaries to the previous chapter, to chapter 16, verse 28, where Jesus says that there are some of you standing here today with me,
right,
who will not taste death until you see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. The majority of Christian commentaries say that was fulfilled with this transfiguration. That's the fulfillment of that prediction. I find it very, very difficult to understand Matthew 16:28 in that way for two reasons, basically. One is that it was the last verse in the previous chapter where Jesus says, "There were some of you standing here today with me who will not taste death until you see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." But chapter 17, verse 1 says this takes place 6 days later. And it just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't sound like, to say that there are some of you standing here with me who will not taste death until you see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. And it's referring to something that's going to take place within 6 days. I mean, it sounds like he's talking about something that's going to happen a bit further along than 6 days from then. But more importantly, there was nothing in this scene of the Transfiguration that even has any remote connection to a kingdom, meaning that the prediction in 1628 was they're going to see the Son of Man in his kingdom. Kingdom has a certain meaning to it. You just can't take a word and strip it of all its normal meaning. To me, it's pretty clear that what is meant at the end of chapter 16 is they're actually going to see Jesus ruling in the world, Jesus having authority and rulership and kingdom, and not just being the leader of a handful of followers. It sounds like he's really describing or trying to describe something really significant, something that would have some meaning in the sense of the kingdom. I think even most Christians, they speak about the kingdom in the sense that it's the fulfillment of everything. So I just have a very, very difficult time accepting this idea that, the prediction that the Son of Man will be coming in his kingdom is just a private revelation to 3 disciples 6 days later.
Right.
I just find it very, very, very difficult. But again, I think many Christians are sort of forced to go there because there wasn't a kingdom that came about during the lifetime of his disciples. So the question is, what did he mean? And they're sort of forced, and again, because of the proximity, it's the very next chapter, they sort of say, well, that must be what he's referring to. But I personally find it very, very difficult. In this story here, you have Peter sort of out of the blue suggesting that they build booths. And, I think everyone's puzzled by this. Like, what is Peter getting at? Like they're having this amazing vision, and not just Jesus transfiguring in front of them, but they see Moses and they see Elijah. It's a whole, show going on here. And Peter says, well, it is good for us to be here. Like, this is an amazing experience. So he says, if you like, I'll make 3 dwellings here. One for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. You'll be able to camp out. And commentaries really struggle with what is Peter getting at. Some suggest that because the experience is so amazing, he wants to prolong it. He wants to have, maybe it'll make sure that Elijah and Moses won't go away so quickly if we have a nice little room for them, which is strange. And others say that what he's saying is because this event is so amazing, maybe we should memorialize it with some memorial, and that's the purpose of the booths. But it seems very strange, and really he's sort of interrupted. I mean, the whole discussion doesn't even get off the ground because they hear the voice of God coming and saying that, this is my son who's my beloved, etc. But it's sort of a strange detail in the story. Now, what's really fascinating about this little piece in the beginning of chapter 17 is all the parallels to Moses at Mount Sinai. For example, in Exodus 24:16, we're told that the glory of God covered Mount Sinai for 6 days. And then after that, Moses is called by God. And this chapter begins 6 days later. Obviously, it's 6 days after the ending of chapter 16. But just the number 6, at least is a parallel. It sort of calls to attention that verse in Exodus 24. And then you have the cloud of God's presence is in both stories. Both stories have the cloud of God's presence. Both stories take place on a mountain. Now here it says that Jesus took them up onto a high mountain. There aren't many very high mountains in Israel, but there are some that are higher than others. But we know that Mount Sinai actually was a low mountain. It was not a very tall mountain. But again, you have mountains in both stories. You have Moses in Exodus chapter 24, verse 1. Moses takes up to the mountain with him Aaron, his brother, and Nadav and Avihu, his 2 children. So you have Moses here taking 3 disciples, so to speak, and Jesus takes his 3 disciples, John, James, and Peter. In both stories, you have someone's face shining. Moses' face shines in chapter 34, verse 35, and Jesus, he shines here as well. He's radiating as well. So you have all these parallels, and there actually may even be some more, between the story of the Transfiguration and the story of Moses up at Mount Sinai. And you actually see, we didn't really discuss this when we did it back in Matthew chapter 2, but you see many parallels between the infancy of Jesus and the infancy stories of Moses. I mean, they're both in danger. You know, someone's about to, well, Moses is a bit older at that point, but, you know, they're out to get Moses, and he has to run away from Egypt, and he has to stay away until, you know, the threat's gone, and Herod is going to come and try and get Jesus, and so they have to leave Dodge, and they have to run away until the threat is gone. So you have these parallels in the Gospels, quite a few of them, between the life of Moses and the life of Jesus. And, you know, it seems that maybe the point is to try and give the impression that Jesus is sort of the new Moses. Jesus is the, you know, the new lawgiver, so to speak. And the question I'd like to ask is, are all these parallels coincidental? Meaning that it just happened to be on the 6th day, that it just happened to be that Moses took 3 people and Jesus took 3 people. Are these all coincidences in the narrative, or was this purposeful writing? Meaning, were these gospel stories written with the express purpose of giving the reader the impression that Jesus really is the next Moses? You know, to call your attention to the Moses story. And
looks like we've got a caller.
Oh, is that for me?
I think it must be. Let's find out. Welcome to Tanakh Talk. This is wil'Liam. Who do we have on the phone?
This is Pamela.
Hi, Pamela. Where are you calling from?
Texas.
Awesome.
My name is Texas Starlies on YouTube.
Okay, very good. And are you calling to talk with Rabbi Skobac?
No, I just want to say,
oh,
Mr. Skobac, and you, excuse me, you know, I'm a Christian.
Okay.
And, you know, my story's long, but the short end of it is, like I would read things like in Matthew. Well, just tell Mr. Skobac thank you for what he's doing.
He can actually hear you right now if you'd like to talk with him.
No, just tell him thank you that, you know,
sure.
He might not see what he's doing, but, you know, I can't speak for people, but he's helped me. Just, you know, I just want to say thank you to Mr. Skobac.
You got it. You got it. We certainly will do that.
You're very welcome. It's great to hear from you.
Okay.
Thank you, Pamela. Bye-bye.
God be with you. Most High God.
Amen. Thank you.
God bless you.
Wow, that was sweet.
That's very nice.
That was very cool. Very cool. Well, Pamela, if you're watching, if you will go to the Tanakh Talk channel, you will find also some other teachers as well, and you'll be able to follow along with Rabbi Skobac if you choose to do so. Every week we do the same day, same time slot every week, and so you're more than welcome to tune in as much as you want and call in if you have questions for sure. So that's very nice, very nice. Okay, Rabbi, go ahead. We'll pick back up where you left off.
So, you know, it's an open question, but I wonder, and I think many other people have, you know, did the evangelists write these stories in order to create an impression? We're going to see this in a few weeks when we get to Matthew 21, where there's a very, very fascinating story that takes place, and it doesn't really parallel well in the other Gospels. You have the story where Jesus, you know, sends someone to get a donkey to ride into Jerusalem. And, you know, in Mark and in Luke, you know, that's what happens. He sends someone, they get a donkey, and they ride into Jerusalem.
Right.
In Matthew, for some reason, Matthew understood the verse in Zechariah chapter 9, which speaks about the king riding into Jerusalem on a donkey. You know, the Hebrew there employs what is called a parallelism. It describes the donkey really in 2 different ways. For example, when the Bible describes Rebecca, it says she was a virgin, she knew no man. It's basically two ways of saying the same thing. And so when the Bible describes the donkey, it describes it using two parallel Hebrew expressions. But Matthew misunderstood Zechariah to be speaking about two animals. So because Matthew understood Zechariah to be speaking about two animals, when he writes the story, he has this messenger grab the two animals, and Jesus ends up mounting both animals. They spread a garment over both animals, and he somehow does this acrobatic act, and he rides into Jerusalem on two animals, which is sort of peculiar. It's sort of bizarre. It doesn't take place in the other gospel accounts.
So you're telling me that Matthew literally stretched what truth he knew to make it fit?
No, I think what Matthew is doing is he's writing the story to line up with what he thinks was supposed to happen. I think that Matthew sees this prophecy in Zechariah, which does speak about the king, the Messiah, riding into Jerusalem on a donkey. So as far as the gospel writers are going, that now Jesus didn't get to Jerusalem on in a motorcycle, so that would have been the way to go. That's not so bizarre to take a donkey with you, but why does Matthew write it in such a way that it's so awkward, and he's mounting two animals and he's riding? I mean, that's you can go a block on two animals, but to go from where he was, one village to another town, that's a long ride, and to manage it on the backs of two animals at the same time is a little bit bizarre. And it's clear that the only reason Matthew wrote the gospel account like this is because he sees it, the way he understands Zechariah is that's what the Hebrew says. So the point is that you can see that the gospel writers, at least in this occasion in Matthew 21, they scripted, they constructed their narrative to line up with what they thought was supposed to happen. And so it's quite possible that, that this story here, the Transfiguration, with all these parallels to the life of Moses, it could have been a conscious effort to write something with all these parallels to give, again, the impression that Jesus is the new Moses. Now, again, this is not a proof that the story didn't happen, but it just makes me wonder, when you see all these parallels between the life of Jesus and the life of Moses, is it a coincidence? Or was it written with that in mind, meaning that it was written and constructed, the narrative was built to create that impression? And there may have been some core to the story. Maybe these are just details that were filled in to, again, make it more I guess, powerful. But I'm just raising it as a question. I don't really have a definitive answer.
Right.
So in verse 9, the story goes on, and when they came down from the mountain, because the story ends sort of abruptly when, when God appears here and says, "This is my son," they freaked out. They got very upset, and so they looked up. They were overcome with fear, and Jesus touched them and said, "Get up, don't be afraid." And when they looked up, no one was there. Moses and Elijah had disappeared by that time. So they were coming down from the mountain in verse 9, and Jesus says to them, "Don't tell anyone about this vision until the Son of Man, until I've been raised from the dead." Now, we saw previously that this is a ongoing problem with the Gospels, in that there's a lot of secretness and a lot of covering up. Jesus telling people, "Don't say that I did these miracles. Don't say I'm the Messiah. Don't say you saw this vision." And the problem is that in John chapter 18, verse 20, at his trial, Jesus tells the Romans that I was never keeping anything secret. Everything was in the open. I was totally transparent. I taught everything openly. There were no secrets. And here you see that, again, he's constantly telling people to keep things secret. And the problem really is that this doesn't help Jesus match up neatly with Isaiah 53, verse 9, which says that the suffering servant of God will have no deceit in his mouth. So to tell the Romans, on the one hand, that everything was out in the open, no secrets, nothing was concealed, and yet to constantly tell his disciples and other people, "Don't reveal this, keep it secret, don't tell anyone," it's a little bit of a problem. Now, what I find very puzzling in this next verse is the question that the disciples ask. I mean, Jesus has just told them, don't tell anyone about this vision. And then they say, why then do the scribes say that Elijah must come first? It's sort of hard to see, like, where is that question coming from? And what I was thinking, maybe what's happening here is that Jesus just told them not to reveal what they had seen. Now, what had they seen? They saw Elijah. And now he's telling them, but don't tell anyone you saw Elijah. But they're saying, but wait a minute, don't we know from the scribes that Elijah has to appear before, meaning before the coming of the Messiah, right? And so as far as they're concerned, this should have been the kind of thing that they do publicize, meaning that this is really supposed to be in the script, that Elijah comes first and then you are supposed to show up. So maybe they're puzzled by the fact that he tells them to keep things hush-hush. So that may be what their question is. It's not 100% clear to me, but then his answer is very strange because he says, Elijah is indeed coming and he'll restore all things, but I tell you that Elijah has already come. Now that's already a little bit of double talk. I mean, that on the one hand, Elijah is indeed coming, and then he says 2 seconds later, but I tell you, he's already come. And they didn't recognize him, but they did to him whatever they pleased. So I find there are numerous problems with this passage. First of all, Jesus is saying two things. He's saying, number one, Elijah is coming. He's going to come in the future. He's coming, and he'll restore all things. And then he says in the next breath, Elijah has already come, meaning that he says it was John the Baptist, John the Baptizer, and they killed him. So the problems here are, number one, this sounds like it's a revelation, you know, this whole thing about, you know, the fact that Elijah already came and then it's John the Baptizer. But if you go back to chapter 11, verse 14, this is old news. Jesus already told his disciples that Elijah the prophet has come back and it was John the Baptizer. A second thing, which is really, really weird here, is that this passage seems to imply that there doesn't only have to be a second coming of the Messiah, but a second coming of Elijah the prophet. You know, we don't usually hear about that. The doctrine of the second coming usually applies to Jesus himself.
Right.
But Jesus seems to be saying here that, yes, Elijah came, and he's going to come again because he hasn't restored all things. So that's pretty weird, the idea that there's a second coming of John the Baptizer, who is Elijah the prophet. And then what is it meant when Jesus says he's going to come to restore all things? Meaning, if he's going to come to restore all things, then what did he come the first time to do? Meaning that, you know, it's strange that the disciples say, isn't this what the scribes teach? It's not what the scribes teach. This is actually what the prophets speak. Malachi says it straight out, that before the coming of the great and awesome day of the Lord, Elijah the prophet's going to return. So it doesn't make sense that the disciples here are saying, you know, isn't this some doctrine teaching of the scribes? No, this is actually very clearly taught directly in the scriptures themselves.
That's very interesting.
Right? And what did it say in Malachi? It says that Elijah is coming to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the hearts of the children to the fathers, meaning that he's going to basically get everyone on the same page in terms of believing in God, which is a huge restoration. And that is what Malachi is telling us Elijah is going to do. And what Jesus seems to be saying here is that when Elijah comes back, he'll do that. But then the question becomes, so what did Elijah or John the Baptizer do the first time he was there? He didn't really seem to do anything. And then, you know, where do you see in the scriptures any evidence for this doctrine of the second coming of Elijah? I mean, you don't really see any evidence in the scriptures for a second coming of the Messiah either, but it's just a peculiar idea that you're going to have two comings of Elijah the prophet. Now, again, to say that Elijah the prophet is John the Baptizer, we already have seen is very, very difficult, because in the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 21, they ask John the Baptizer to his face, "Are you Elijah?" He says, "No, I'm not." So that's just something we've gone over before. in the past. Now, what I found really, really interesting about this little piece here is that the evangelist, whoever it is, whether it was Matthew or someone writing and claiming it's Matthew, it's not really clear to me, but whoever the evangelist is letting something slip here, very, very, I think, sort of unusual, because throughout the Gospels, we've seen already that there has been a marked attempt to give the impression that the real danger to Jesus are those rascally rabbis, those Pharisees, and those scribes, and those Sadducees. And there's never any concern about Romans who were running around tearing up the country, crucifying people left and right. You don't get the impression that Jesus is in any danger at all from the Romans. It's only those rabbis. But here, what's interesting is that Matthew lets it slip that the real threat to Jesus is not the Jews, because he says here that they did to him whatever they pleased, and the Son of Man is about to suffer at their hands. Now, who is it that killed John the Baptizer? It wasn't the Pharisees, it wasn't the Sadducees, it wasn't the scribes. It was Herod Antipas. And he was basically a puppet of the Romans. He's not, someone that was a real representative of the Jewish people. The Jewish people couldn't stand him. So what Matthew seems to be saying is that the same powers that put John the Baptizer to death are going to put Jesus to death as well, which are the Romans. And so to me, it's fascinating that this sort of slips by. Now, when I read John MacArthur's commentary to Matthew, he's like probably one of the most popular evangelical Protestant scholars in the world today. He has a very popular commentary to the New Testament. He says something which really floored me. He writes in his commentary, it were the Jewish leaders had killed John. He writes, actually, the Jewish leaders had John killed, and Jesus was about to suffer the same. Now, how in the world MacArthur makes it seem that Herod Antipas is a Jewish leader? I mean, normally the Jewish leaders are the scribes and the rabbis and the Sanhedrin and even the Pharisees. Those are the Jewish leaders. Herod Antipas, first of all, it's very unclear if he's even a Jew, meaning that his father is an Idumean, and his mother is Malthus, who is a Samaritan woman. And so whether halachically he's even Jewish is very questionable. It's also raises the interesting question, if he's not even Jewish, why was John the Baptizer so upset about the marriage that he had? He seemed to be ejected on the grounds of Jewish law. So that's the big question mark over the whole story. But even if he was Jewish, we know that he was appointed king, meaning that he was made the ruler by, the Romans. By Caesar Augustus was the one that basically appointed him, named him the ruler. He was never elected by the Jews. He was never accepted by the Jews. So how MacArthur says that John the Baptizer had been killed by the Jewish leaders is totally floors me. And again, it shows sort of this, I guess, his instincts coming out that those were the real enemies of Jesus, were the Jewish leaders. In this story, that doesn't come out. In this story, it's clear that the Jewish leaders really were not involved with the death of John the Baptizer. So in verse 14, we go back to one of our famous miracle stories, healing stories. But here it's with a bit of a twist, that Jesus comes to a crowd, and some fellow comes to him and kneels down and says, look, you have to have mercy on my son. He's an epileptic, suffers terribly. He often falls into the fire. He falls into the water. He's having these near-death experiences. And he complains. He's coming to the complaint department. He says, look, Jesus, I brought him to your disciples, but they couldn't cure him. Now, that's sad. I mean, here's someone that's in great turmoil. He's in great stress. He's pleading for help. And to me, Jesus' response is just very, very cranky. And it's sort of surprising because, he doesn't express any sympathy towards his fellow, any concern. He launches into this tirade, which seems to be very inappropriate. He says, "You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I be with you? How much longer must I put up with you?" I mean,
wow,
that's not what I would call bedside manner. I mean,
it seems like he's more focused on performance than he is actually compassion towards the one who is sick. Is what,
well, he seems really, really ticked off with his followers, with his disciples. But I mean, so, you know, berate them in private, take them, you know, aside and give them hell. But this guy has just been pleading and crying. You know, he's got a kid that's really, really, really sick. And Jesus, it's almost as if he turns to his disciples and saying, like, what's wrong with you guys? You know, can't you do something simple? I mean, Jesus had sent them in, I think it was previously, where was it? In chapter 10, verse 8, where Jesus had commissioned his disciples to go around and healing people, right? I'm going to give you this power. You'll be able to heal people in my name. So that's what they should have been doing the last, you know, 7 chapters.
Right.
And he just seems furious with them. I mean, and the expression he uses to say perverse and faithless is exactly how he described the Jewish leaders who didn't accept him in chapter 12, verse 39 and 12:45 and 11. So I just find that this is, you know, they're catching him, or we're catching Jesus here in a very cranky moment. And then he seems to say to his disciples here that, you know, how much faith do you have? He seems to be saying you don't even seem to have the faith of a mustard seed, meaning that it's the smallest seed in the world. And even that much faith you don't have, he says to them, because if you had even that much faith, you'd be able to lift up mountains.
Yeah, good point.
So he seems to be saying that his own disciples, these are the people that, you know, were his followers, his loyal followers. You know, he seems to be saying that you don't have any faith. Anyway, it's a disturbing interaction. And then in verse 22, he again predicts his own death and resurrection, and says in verse 22, they were gathering in the Galilee, and Jesus said to them, the Son of Man is going to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him, and on the 3rd day he'll be raised up. And they were greatly distressed. Now, you know, you keep on hearing from Christians that Jewish people are not able to see Jesus in Isaiah 53 because they're spiritually blind. They have scales over their eyes. I mean, many Christians just seem totally bewildered. How could you not see Jesus in Isaiah 53? It's so clear to them. And, you know, it's interesting that here, his own disciples, who obviously we assume don't have scales covering their eyes, they're not spiritually blind, they don't see Jesus as being spoken of in Isaiah 53. We saw the same thing back in chapter 16 when Jesus tells Peter and the disciples, look, now that you say I'm the Messiah, you really have to go to Jerusalem and get killed and raised up on the 3rd day. And they say, what are you talking about? That can't happen to you. And every single time in the Gospels Jesus foretells his death, none of the people say, well, obviously you have to be killed. That's what is going to happen to the, you know, the suffering servant of Isaiah. No one seems to make that connection. And it's hard to understand why they're so distressed, meaning he just told them, you know, for the 2nd time that he's going to have to go and be killed, and they just seem so upset. You know, you would think that the one thing they would know if they believe in Jesus is Isaiah 53. They would have known that that's the whole purpose of the Messiah's coming, is to die for their sins. But they seem to be totally unaware of that. They seem to be incredibly operating with the same concept of the Messiah that Jewish people have, which the Messiah is going to come and reign as a king and restore the world to, you know, a place of peace. They seem to be operating with that perspective. They don't seem to be operating with the perspective that the whole purpose of the Messiah coming is to die. Purpose of him coming, they wouldn't be distressed that he was going to die. That would be his whole purpose in coming. And also, you know, if I tell you that I'm going to take away your prized ring, if you have a ring that's been like your prized ring, it's worth everything in the world to you, I'm going to take it away forever, you'd be upset. But if I tell you, I'm taking it away, but I'm going to give it back to you in 3 days, all right, you can live with that. So he just told them he's not going to be going forever. He told them that I'm going to die, but I'm coming back 3 days later. So at the end of the day, it's like a hiccup. What's the tragedy? It's not really someone who's dying at that point. When someone dies and they're resurrected 3 days later, it's almost as if they didn't die. It doesn't seem to be the kind of thing that you're going to get all bent out of shape over. So it's sort of a strange, ongoing problem in the Gospels that the disciples seem to be totally out of the loop in terms of what Christianity ultimately believes. At the end of the chapter, we'll just wrap up with this. You have this interesting piece about the temple tax, that when they came to Kfar Nachum, I think when English readers, they read the city as Capernaum. I'm not sure how you pronounce it in English, but it's Kfar Nachum. It's the farm or the village of Nachum. And they came to that city, and the tax collectors of the temple came to Peter, and they said, does your teacher pay the temple tax or not? It's interesting. Usually the opponents of Jesus came and challenged him about what his disciples were doing. And here they're coming to the disciples and asking them about what Jesus is doing. So Peter says, yeah, he does pay the tax. So Peter says, look, that's what he does. Jesus pays the tax. Don't get all, take a chill pill. But when he came home, when Jesus returned home, so Jesus spoke of this, asking, what do you think, Simon? It's Simon Peter. Right? What do you think, Simon Peter? From whom do kings of the earth take toll or tribute? From their children or from others? So obviously he's saying that kings don't take tribute from their own children. They only take it from other people. And so the implication is that, he being, I guess, the Son of God, or being, someone very special, shouldn't have to pay tribute or tax to the temple. And almost by implication, the followers of him as well. And Peter said, obviously from other people, not from the children of the king. So Jesus said, then the children are free. He seems to be saying that none of us have to pay the temple tax. However, so they do not give offense to them, go to the sea, cast a hook, take the first fish that comes up. When you open its mouth, you'll find a coin. Take it and give it to them for you and me. So obviously it was a coin that was enough to cover the temple tax, which was a half shekel. This is going to cover it for both of them. The thing that I'll tell you, this has been bothering me since almost the beginning of the Gospels, and it really bothers me throughout the rest of the Gospels we'll be reading. The standard Christian doctrine is that Jesus is God. Jesus claimed to be God. That the followers of Jesus understood him to be God, and that's the conventional wisdom in the world of Christendom. What I find interesting is that you never hear any of the disciples really speaking about Jesus as if he's God, or acting in his presence as if he's God. If Peter had thought, for example, that Jesus was God who created heavens and earth, and these nudniks are asking him, hey, did your teacher, your rabbi, did he pay the temple tax? I could imagine Peter saying to them, what are you, crazy? Him having to pay he's God. He owns the temple. What are you talking about? And, it's the kind of response that could come up in so many different stories in the Gospels, where the disciples should be expressing their understanding, of who Jesus is, but you don't see it. And to me, it's pretty clear that these are people that did not see or conceive of Jesus as God. They didn't worship him as God. They didn't think he was God. They may have had an elevated view of who he was, but you never really see them speaking about him or acting in his presence in the way they would act in the presence of God. They seem to be relating to him as just a teacher, a human being. Now, many Christian commentaries see this story as teaching that the Old Testament laws had no claim on Jesus or his followers. And that's, again, standard, I guess, churchianity. That, this is, again, for them, an example of the fact that Jesus has basically done away with the temple, done away with the Torah. Again, I'm coming from the perspective that I believe that Jesus was essentially Torah observant, never did away with the importance of observing the Torah law. Now, again, there are times in the Gospels where it's hard to really keep that perspective, and then I have to question whether the stories are really being reported accurately, or maybe there are examples where Jesus did have a different point of view, meaning that giving the half shekel, that was actually biblical law. It was a requirement, at least up until the temple was destroyed, and this is before the temple was destroyed. So for someone to say, well, we don't really have to do it anymore, although at the end of the day, he complies. I mean, he says we should observe it just so they don't get upset with us. But it may have been an example of where Jesus didn't have the proper view of the law here. Certainly, if he really believed that, as either the Messiah or being some special human being, he doesn't have to observe the law, that would be a problem. Mm-hmm. So, again, if really as Christians insist this story teaches us that Jesus is teaching that the law is not binding, at least upon him or his disciples, that would be all the reason for rejecting Jesus, meaning it would be impeachment. It would be grounds for impeachment. But in my understanding of Jesus, and especially the early church, the first Jewish followers, I think all the evidence points to the fact that they were essentially Torah observant. I don't think that, they accepted, the idea that they could eat whatever they want and they don't have to keep the Sabbath, etc. So this is either a story that never happened, and they're just trying to make Jesus seem like he's someone that rejects the Torah, because again, that became the agenda of the later Pauline Gentile church. And again, we have to remember that the Gospels are all written possibly under the influence already of the spread of Paul's doctrines, or it could be an example where Jesus was wrong on this one, meaning that for him to say something that clearly violates the Torah, I would say is a problem. But I don't think it's fair to say, based upon this, it's clear that he has rejected the entire Torah and all of Torah observance. Right. So to me, I'm left with a question mark here. And I think that's all she wrote for chapter 17.
Yeah. I was thinking about Ezekiel 36:27. There's that verse is really one of the verses that's very problematic for church theology in general. Even if Jesus was the Messiah, and even if he did come, and let's just say hypothetically, which it's not, that the New Testament was true, the understanding of it could be skewed very incorrect about it being teaching against the laws of God just because of Ezekiel 36:27. Because every pastor, every preacher, every person who knows the New Testament that I've ever spoken with, I'd ask them a question. I'd say, well, at what point in time did the Holy Spirit come to where it was available for everyone? And they would say, after Jesus died. They said it wasn't until after his death when the Holy Spirit was made available for us, like in Acts chapter 2. And so using that idea and comparing that with Ezekiel 36:26 and 27, where it says, I will put my spirit within you, and I will cause you to keep my commandments.
Right. It's also Ezekiel chapter 11 says the same thing.
So how they could possibly overlook that it would be catastrophic.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big problem, because to say that when the Messiah comes, the Torah is done away with, I mean, directly contradicts, for example, Ezekiel chapter 37, which is probably the clearest passage in the scriptures about the Messiah himself, the person of the Messiah. And there it speaks about the fact that when the Messiah is here, the Jewish people are going to all be observing the Torah.
Right.
So it is a huge problem. And again, I think that my read of, let's say, the Gospels and even the book of Acts, for sure the book of Acts, and the early Christian history of the Nazarenes and the Ebionites, and all the evidence that I've seen points to the fact that at the end of the day, Jesus and his followers were Torah observant. There may have been some glitches, but I would say that generally speaking, they were Torah observant. And so when we read a story like this, which raises the question about his fidelity to the Torah, we've got to somehow put it into the bigger context.
Right.
And I think that you can't go from this story to what many Christian commentaries say, which is you see from this story that he basically has rejected the entire Old Testament. I think that's just unfounded.
Right, agreed. Rabbi, have you got time for a call?
Sure.
Okay. Welcome to Tanakh Talk. This is William. Who do I have on the phone?
Hi, I'm William. This is Miriam.
Oh, hi, Miriam. How are you doing?
Good. I'm usually not home to be able to even listen while it's live. But I have a question for Rabbi Skobac.
Go right ahead.
From what I understand, already, I think it was 300 years later, the time of Constantine, or by the Council of Nicaea, where they were debating whether Jesus was human or divine. Correct?
No, they were really, by that time, they all thought he was divine. The only question was how to understand his divinity, meaning that basically the entire church.
Wasn't there a time when the question came up whether he was actually divine or not?
Not by the 4th century, meaning by the Council of Nicaea, the entire sort of normal church saw him as divine. That was pretty much already widespread, by the end of the 2nd century. The only question was,
when did this issue come up? At what time frame?
Which issue are you referring to? Whether he's divine or not?
He's actually a divine or a human.
Yeah, I think.
What?
So that was something that, for example, you see in the writings by the church fathers that are attacking the Ebionites and the Nazarenes. So you have church fathers in the 3rd and 2nd and 4th century that are attacking the Jewish Christians for being heretics. And one of the things they attack them for is their belief that Jesus is just human. But you see already that, the Jewish followers of Jesus at that point were a dying breed, meaning that by the, 2nd and 3rd centuries, they're about to just exit from the stage of history. And, the church by that time already, even probably by the end of the 1st century, probably by the time the Gospel of John is written, Paul's movement, has already been running, pretty much for 50 years already, and they've become by far the dominant group within the Christian world, and that they had all by that time, I'm positive, by the end of the 1st century, Paul's Gentile church that was spreading had already come to the position that Jesus was divine. It wasn't controversial for them. Meaning you don't find in Paul's Gentile church a lot of arguments over this. The only question was how to understand his divinity. That's what the Council of Nicaea was debating. Given that he's divine, but how do you understand his divinity? Is he wholly, entirely at one substance with God or not? I mean, it became the kind of things that they went to war over in the 3rd and 4th and 5th centuries. They fought bitterly over these sort of minutia of how exactly to understand his divinity. But this was one of the dividing points between the Jewish Christians, or became in the 2nd century known as the Nazarenes and the Ebionites, and the rest of the Pauline Church. The two, really, the critical issues that divided them was, number one, their understanding of the eternal binding nature of the Torah, and their understanding that Jesus was simply a human being, not divine. And the normal standard beliefs among Paul's movement, which was really outstripping the Jewish group by far. I mean, once the temple was destroyed and Jerusalem was destroyed in the year 70, the Jewish church, what was called the Jerusalem church, they were decimated, and they fled to Jordan, and there were just few of them left, and they were a tiny splintered minority in basically an overwhelming sea of Gentile Christians who followed Paul's teachings who basically did not believe the Torah was binding anymore, and they didn't believe that Jesus was just a human being. They believed he was God. Now, whether or not Paul thought Jesus was God is debatable. It's not really clear. Paul is sort of gives mixed messages, and whatever Paul actually believed, what is obvious is that his listeners understood him to be speaking about Jesus as God. You know, whether Paul had a nuanced view of who Jesus was, his listeners did not catch the nuance. I mean, to them, you know, just like in the Roman world, the emperors were gods, you know, so for the Gentile listeners of Paul, they basically came to the conclusion that Jesus had to be God.
Yeah, but wasn't this problematic for them if Jesus' students and people and Jews around him who knew him understood that he was saying, keep the Torah? Isn't this a big problem for them where they came later and they were more like secondhand, and time-wise they were further away?
100%. That's, I mean, we spoke about this a week or two ago, that, you know, the Gospels are written, one of the things that you constantly see happening is they're written to show that the disciples of Jesus are clueless. You know, because basically Paul was in constant you know, tension with the followers of Jesus who knew him and studied with him. And so when the New Testament is being written, it's being written by the victors of this struggle. The victors were not the Jewish followers of Jesus. And so, you know, it's been suggested that one of the reasons that the Gospels are written to show that the disciples are clueless, they don't get anything, they're a bunch of nitwits. You know, even when you have Peter denying Jesus at the end, you know, people have suggested it's written in order to really diminish the credibility of the Jewish church, so to speak, and to bolster the credibility of Paul, because Paul is always attacking, you know, the other disciples. He sort of mockingly, sarcastically calls them super apostles, you know, and he says, I didn't really give them much credibility, he says. So you see that there's this huge struggle between Paul and the followers of Jesus who actually were with him and studied with him and knew him. And you know, really, Paul should have lost this fight. You're right. It should have been a huge problem for Paul that he was not seen as being consistent with the followers of Jesus. And you know, the only reason it really tilted towards Paul was, number one, the followers of Jesus, the Jewish ones, were decimated in the year 70. Most of them were probably killed when Jerusalem was destroyed. They have to flee to Jordan. The group is splintered, and they're very small, and they're basically in a pathetic state. And the Paul's movement, you know, he's very successful because he has a very, very receptive audience. You have people throughout Asia Minor, ancient Greek and ancient Roman places where they were very receptive to Paul's message. He's able to, you know, attract large numbers of followers, and you know, he basically calls the shots in terms of how the story is being told. There are scholars that say that the whole book of Acts was written basically to play down the tension between Paul and the apostles. I have to really get off the air in a minute, but I'll just recommend two books. One is a book called How Jesus Became Christian by Barry Wilson. It's an important book that shows you know, how these two groups really split apart from each other, but how the book of Acts was written to downplay the tension between the groups. So that book is called How Jesus Became Christian by Barry Wilson. The other book is called Paul and Jesus by James Tabor. And what Professor Tabor does in his book is to really show the tremendous disparity between Paul and Jesus on very, very critical theological issues. But your question is a really important question. It would deserve probably about 2 or 3 hours to fully explore.
Okay, I just wanted to mention one thing. Years ago, I'd read in a book that these believers of Jesus who were Jewish and still kept the law, that some of them went to Syria. And then years ago, I was in touch with somebody who had been in India searching out the 10 tribes, and he came across a group of, I don't know what they were exactly, but they were living in the southern part of India, southwest, and they kept some form of Judaism, but they believed in Jesus, and they had a tradition that they came from Syria. So my idea was that they might have come from that group. It was a very little booklet I once found some when I was in Israel years and years ago. And then later on, I met this rabbi who told me the story about these people, and I put two and two together. So they're still there, I think, some of them anyway. I don't know exactly what their status is at this point.
Yeah, I would say it's speculative. I mean, there are groups in India, the B'nai Menashe, for example, who trace themselves back to the tribe of Menashe. I'm
familiar with the B'nai Menashe. This is a group at the total opposite other end, southwest, B'nai Menashe, northeast, and nothing to do with one another.
I'm just saying that there are the B'nai Menashe became Christianized much later, and so if you do find Jewish people living in India that believe in Christian things, it's not necessarily because they go all the way back 2,000 years. They could have been Jewish people who later ended up converting to Christianity, and then you have now examples of people with Jewish roots in India that have Christian beliefs, but not necessarily because they go back 2,000 years with that. Again, it would be interesting to further explore that. So I appreciate you raising the possibility.
Very good. Okay. Miriam, thank you so much for your call. Appreciate talking to you. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay. Shalom, shalom.
All the best. Good night.
Rabbi, it's been a great episode once again. Folks, tune in again next week, same time, same place for another episode coming right up. So meanwhile, visit Rabbi Michael Skobac at www.JewsForJudaismCanada.ca. Shalom, shalom, everyone. Shalom, Rabbi. I love you much. Thank you for your time.
Be well.
Awesome.
Shalom, shalom.
Shalom, shalom.
אני אתה אתם תמיד תמיד כולם ביחד חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד איפוק זו העוצמה ויתור זו הגדולה השאיפה והכמיהה